Hi everyone, welcome back to UX Bristol. I hope you enjoyed this morning's sessions. If you've been able to join us, we've had some absolutely fantastic talks. Really happy to welcome Tom Ridley for our next talk this afternoon. Hi Tom, thanks for joining us. Tom's a UX practitioner, sound designer, artist and musician who spent the last 8 years crafting experiences for physical and digital products, as well as for gallery, headphone and stage. He was a formative member of the products experience team at Dyson and now leads a digital product design team at a music tech scale-up called Pirate.com here in Bristol. And in this talk, Beyond the Beeps Designing with Sound, Tom's going to demystify the field of product sound and provide some fundamental principles, ideas and techniques such that any of us design practitioners without a shred of musical ability, that's definitely me, could begin to explore product sound and put it to test. So looking forward to it. Thanks, Tom. And over to you, Kirsty, to play the video.
Hi everyone, my name's Tom. I am primarily a UX designer, but have spent almost all of my adult life in and around music and composition, production, a little bit of film. And over the last few years, these worlds have collided more and more often. And I've been asked to design sounds and sonic experiences to augment or solve problems during user journeys using products or services. And so the aim of this talk, it's going to be a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully it'll demystify a little bit the field of sound design in the context of products and services, present some ideas which might allow you to have a go at certainly the UX side of sound and using sound as a feedback mechanism or as a means of communicating or conveying information to users, and give you some tools which might give you a starting point. So, beep. I looked up the definition: a short, high-pitched sound emitted by electronic equipment or a vehicle horn. Now, here's some beeps. I think that's one of the earliest examples of using sound as a kind of essentially UX or a user interface mechanism. That's an answering machine. That's my microwave. And it does that when it's finished. And then perhaps in the context of slightly more modern products, you might have Bluetooth speakers that do something like this. But then there are more, perhaps even more glossy or modern product experiences that don't quite fit the definition of beep. That's actually one of the early sounds from AOL Instant Messenger in the 90s. I'm sure you guys all know what that is. If you've ever sat next to an iPhone user on the train, you might have been driven insane by this, or heard that. If anyone has AirPods made by Apple as well, they have some of the loveliest sounds. They were really hard to record, but I did manage to get my recorder in there, and they sound like that, or like that when they run out of battery. Excuse me, that was that one again. For those of you who subscribe to BBC News, you might get a sense of dread like I do whenever that happens. Oh God, what's happened? Or for those of you who grew up like I did in the mid-2000s, that was probably every evening after school on MSN Messenger. Facebook. I'm sure every designer knows what this is, as well as this. And some of you might even remember Windows 95. I just remember it. And then lastly, don't do that. We've all been inside with our own thoughts for the last year or so, and I'm sure have turned to this for a bit of comfort, which is of course Netflix. So my work today, I work for a company called Pirate.com. It's actually I lead a digital design team. I don't design sounds for them at all, but I'm enjoying it very much. But my sound design journey actually started when I was at Dyson. I went through engineering into the MPI team and then ended up in design and product experience, where we kind of define the usability and user experience journeys that so many millions of people enjoy today. And when the Dyson Chorale hair straightener project kicked off, someone said, "Tom, you should probably kind of listen to that because you're into music, aren't you?" And not unreasonably, a quite primitive sort of 5-volt school science kit buzzer had been put into the product, and it was making some sounds, as most hair straighteners do. And the design manager at the time said, if you think you can do better, go ahead and do it. And that started a rabbit hole of a couple of years, actually, amongst other things, understanding, what levers I could pull with sound, which we'll talk about in a minute, in order to effectively convey information to users of a hair straightener and consider where they are, where the product is, what the product's doing, and what else is happening to users. So here's some of the sounds that we designed ultimately for the Dyson Corral. I don't have the original files. They stayed on my laptop when I left, but I did manage to find these online, so the quality is not too great. So when the product turns on, it does that, just to let you know you've completed the button combination to turn the product on. And when it gets hot, it does that. If the battery gets low, and then if it runs out, if you leave it on for too long, if you lock it without turning it off, if you charge it, a bit like a phone that goes when you plug it in, it does that. And then lastly, if there's a problem, and they were tested to death, as well as incredible amount of revisions just sort of creatively to get the right aesthetic that kind of matched the marketing materials and the kind of feel of the campaign for our hair care range. And that was the first project that I completed. And then I was dragged onto the electric car project, which unfortunately, never saw the light of day. But what was fascinating there was, as well as the internal sounds, I was tasked with defining and designing the driving sound, so the sort of synthetic engine noise that, as of 2018, became compulsory for all electric vehicles in Europe. And that's a live system. As you put your foot down, as you turn corners and change gears, the sound responds accordingly. And the question, of course, is, well, what does an electric car sound like? And the intention, of course, is so that you don't hit pedestrians, and so that people hear the vehicle coming, because they're so quiet. But in which case, you need it to sound like a vehicle, and to some extent dangerous, and that perhaps, or I was of the opinion that we needed to drag in the kind of essence of a combustion engine to say this is a vehicle and this is moving quickly. But also, we didn't want to record an engine and play that back. We wanted to have something that sounded modern and futuristic and electric, and also like the enormous vehicle, an SUV that this car was. So that was, and also there was so much legislation. Where automotive is racked with legislation, not unreasonably, right? But that was an incredible. There were so many factors in tension there. I learned a lot doing that project as well, and unfortunately, I'm not able to play you any of those sounds. So, and then lastly, there's many other projects that I've worked on over the last couple of years for various companies, either in a consulting role or in-house, which haven't seen the light of day yet, so I'm not able to share those either, but hopefully there'll be some cool stuff coming soon. Here's a nice little thought. This was catalysed by a guy called Tom Saunders, who's a friend of a friend. He works at Torchbox, and we had a little chat on LinkedIn, and I said, hey, there was something you said a while ago that sort of left a seed in my head, and can we talk about it? Now, I haven't quoted Tom here because I don't know if he quite stands by it. We had a debate, but I thought it was a nice idea anyway. And that is that designers don't need to know which design is right. Our job is to create concepts and materials to put to test. Trust the process. And I think particularly in the context of me encouraging you as maybe a non-musician to have a go with sound, I think this is really important to remember that you don't need to know which is right. Here's some tools and ideas about, how you might apply sound or the use of sound, and then go test it. So some principles for designing with sound. So I'm going to be light on the UX stuff. You guys know it, but when mapping out a journey, think about where the little moments might solve problems, or where little interventions might delight users or influence their behavior and make sure that they do the thing that you need them to do. And I'm not actually an advocate for more sound. I'm an advocate for good sound and appropriate use of sound. So think about what those multi-sensory inputs might be that visual, be that haptic, be that audible, whatever else. I don't know how to design a taste interface, but please tell me if you do. And here's some further UX considerations that you might want to think about. So what is the aim of the intervention. Does the user need to take action? And you might want to think, are they even able to do it right now? Is it urgent or safety critical, in which case you need to make sure that they know that and they do take that action quickly. Is the product maybe just showing off how clever it is, in which case that's fine, but maybe we should be respectful and a little bit sparing in how often we use that. Is it to reinforce a brand? That's also fine. I mean, you can perhaps do that through just the aesthetic qualities ultimately of the sounds anyway, but there is definitely a case for sort of experiential stuff, which could be really delightful. And is it just for fun? And that's okay too, but it's important to know what the aim of the intervention is and what you're trying to get from it. Context. As I said, it's important to consider the user's multi-sensory experience. So what else is happening? What are they doing? Does the product already have their attention? And what else is the product doing? Is it emitting other sensory cues, light, sound, smell? Because maybe they give enough information. What you don't want to do is overload. There's a sound, there's a smell, and there's a visual display. That's probably too much. I think sounds are particularly good at catching it or gathering attention or demanding attention when maybe the product doesn't already have the user's attention. Where is the user? Are they outside? Is it noisy? Lots of people genuinely have asked me, why doesn't the Dyson vacuum cleaner make sounds? Because it's making loads of sound. It just doesn't work. Seems obvious, but perhaps isn't. Where is the product in relation to the user? Is it in their hand? Is it over there? Is it in the other room? Because that's going to perhaps influence the type of sound you make, when you make a sound, how often you make a sound, how loud it is, all kinds of things. And how much context has the user had? And that's so important, which my next slide will attest to, actually. You can't expect sounds to work too hard. Context is everything. Sounds are really good at, based on what's happening now, what you've either asked me to do, what you know that I'm doing, what you expect me to do, has something good or bad happened within that context. If you ask me to make coffee, the coffee is done or it is not done. If you ask me to clean the floor, I cleaned the floor, well done me, or I had a problem, can you help? If you just make a sound without that context, it may not mean much other than oi over here. It's also quite easy to express urgency. You can make something sound pretty scary or pretty chilled. And also you can use real world sounds, skeuomorphism if you will, to drag in context. So in a moment we'll talk a bit about a coffee maker and how you could conceivably imagine how water sounds. If I said imagine water, you can go, yeah, kind of got it. That might be powerful. But if I said imagine how batteries sound, a bit harder. So where possible, dragging in real world skeuomorphic or reference points can be helpful, but is not always possible, particularly with modern technologies that are quite abstract in their nature. Lastly, what's the spread of good to bad? Because what you don't want to do is get X months through a project and then another problem comes up, it might catch fire. Well, I've already gone 100% on all my sounds. I've got no more severity to convey. So it is important to map out really comprehensively and exhaustively, all of the things that you might need to convey such that you can correctly space them from good to bad and maybe leave a little bit of headroom either way. I mean, you don't want people to think that there's that the house is burning down anyway, but still, there's often something that comes up in my experience. Now, talking about the coffee machine idea, this is just really an example to frame a couple of ideas. Let's imagine that there's a smart coffee machine that we're working on. It learns when you drink coffee. It knows when you've got meetings, so it makes more coffee. It orders consumables and replaces them for you, which would be really cool. I wish mine did that. And it alerts you when there's a problem and if it needs maintenance. Well, if we spread out those potential, sounds, coffee's ready, great. Maybe there's been a minor problem. I couldn't make coffee this time, but next time I will. No worry. You don't have to do anything. Just know that, sorry, I didn't make coffee. There's been a problem that you need to fix. Otherwise, coffee shortage, big deal, particularly for designers. And there's been a serious problem. You need to get involved. But then maybe there's some slightly softer, more experiential things that we might want to convey. So maybe we want to say good morning when they get into the office. If it knows, perhaps it's connected and it knows your location or with geofencing and it goes, morning, you're here and I'm about to make coffee. So cool. I bet you're glad you bought me. You might want to say, this is a bit nerdy, sorry, water quality is poor today. You should consider adding more softener. Now that's maybe not urgent. It doesn't prevent coffee from happening, but it's sort of a nice little thing. And maybe you just want to say that, what a great job I've done. More beans are on the way, and you've got 3 coffee breaks remaining. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in a moment. So the levers of sound that I mentioned, this is hopefully enlightening for non-musical people, and hopefully an interesting deconstruction for those of you who are familiar with music, or the building blocks of music. So these, in the context of sound design at least, are kind of the 4 things that I think are the main parameters that you might want to think about. Excuse me. Pace and rhythm. So pace being, if you imagine the core grid of graph paper on which you place musical events, there is a constant underlying tempo, and if you put things on the grid lines, they occur at equidistant moments. You could consider the core tempo of all of your sounds, if they're rhythmic, which they probably will be, and rhythm being actually how you space those things. So are they straight on the lines, or is there some fluctuation? This will become clear in a moment. And that can help to convey urgency, mood. Strength is also important, and by that I mean if you imagine hitting a piano key really hard or hitting it gently, similar with a guitar or a drum, there's more than just loudness going on there. There's some timbral shifts that happen when you strike something really hard, and you can quite easily simulate some of those things in software to affect how a sound feels. And if you think of it in context of language, the word design, it's strong, weak, weak, strong, design. If you go design, feels a bit weird. No one goes UX design. And actually, that kind of intonation is important in sounds too, but it's not. It's quite intuitive and human if you can understand language. So I don't think that's particularly musical. It's just a thing of sound, right? Pitch, obvious, but deliberately third in the list. I think that's less important than the other things. And then lastly, timbre. And all of these things aid comprehension and or brand perception, but really as UXers, I'm concerned with this, and I'm encouraging you to be concerned with this too. Pace and rhythm, strength, and pitch will aid comprehension. The timbre and the brand perception are more tightly linked, and maybe you don't need to worry about that until you're making final assets. Maybe you hire someone for that or whatever, but you can do all the thinking that underpins it and validate the use of sound on your own, I hope. So, pace and rhythm. Straight musical events on those grid lines that I described. If you halve that, there is a musical event every other grid line, and that a little bit less urgent than that. If we then think about strength, that implies more of an echo, perhaps. If you start to put things, not quite on the grid and move them around a bit, you get quite a sort of bouncy, galloping feel. And if you do this, you get just quite a subtle, sort of da-da, but of equal strength, 1, 2. Now, if you modulate the strength of those, strong, weak, like design, weak, strong, you get a different mood again. 3, different again, and something different again. Now, we could speculate about what those might mean, but hopefully they sort of felt different to you. Now, if we think about pitch, we'll take the last 3. So that becomes something quite positive has happened. If we descend the pitch, sounds like something might have finished, perhaps, and perhaps becomes, which in context maybe sounds like there's been a problem. And there's our 3 families of sounds. Now, if we think about the timbre and brand perception piece, you might start to change those sounds a little bit to suit the mood or the aesthetic, if you will, of a product or a service, be that your UI or your industrial design or your car or whatever it is. And you might become, and might become. So now they're based on a clarinet with some nerdy stuff going on the computer, but they have a slightly more elegant feel. I did them quite quickly, but they could work. If we try and drag those ideas into the context of the coffee machine, well, here's all of the sounds that we talked about. Here is coffee ready. Nice. That sounds positive to me. I couldn't make coffee this time, but next time I will. Like negative, but not the end of the world, right? Like it's like sorry. And there's a sort of language thing there again, right? Dragging a little bit of intonation in from speech. Now, whether that works internationally, that perhaps that's a westernization. So it's perhaps worth thinking about whether, the reference points that as British people or people working in the UK, whether the ones that are meaningful to us might not be meaningful to everyone. So that's really important to test always. And let's try another one. There's been a problem. Fix soon to avoid coffee shortage. Okay, that's just done, fine. And a serious problem, right. Now I've done a bit of music theory there. I've done a second interval, which is quite atonal, to express a severe problem. But you'd probably get that if you were just fiddling about. Good morning. Now it's not fully positive like this, but it's like, hopefully a sort of rising, like, positive feeling. Coffee's on. And then the last two, I wanted to make the point that they're similar in that they're both sort of just info. Here's the thing, and frankly, you obviously can't convey the quality of water. Well, you could try, but you might have a hard time conveying water quality or I've ordered beans through some sounds. But you might want to get the user's attention in an office and have them come over to the machine, and you might display a message to say, I've done a clever thing. In which case, for these kinds of things, I usually recommend, or in my experience, it's been helpful to have a single sound that becomes recognizable as some interesting info for you to look at, and then you can change what info that is. So in this case, maybe it's that. Now, that's not fully sort of bright and positive like that, but it's a bit more like, almost sounds like maybe the announcement on a train is about to happen or something. And they're all using that same clarinet sound, which is, just a little bit gentler than... Which, by the way, whilst I was making this demo, I realised sounds the same as... So I'm dangerously close to synth pop there. Easy tools for making sounds. So voice memos on your phone is absolutely incredible. The quality of the mics on these things is surprisingly good. In a pinch, you could even, get away with recording things on phones and putting them into production. Like, they sound really good. Also, just in terms of digital tools for iOS devices specifically, I'm afraid I don't know about Android. Figure is a really good one. You can make lots of sounds. It's designed for kind of making silly dance music, but there's actually some quite good sounds in there with some quite easy and intuitive control. Sampler is a bit like voice memos on steroids. You can pitch the sounds, shorten them, lengthen them, loop them, make reverb, delay. You could literally design all the sounds for a product with a nice little source recording of hitting a glass and then punching around on there. Honestly, it's so good. And then Animoog is a really fun touch synthesizer, which is just worth a go. I think it is a bit expensive. It might be 25 quid or something, but it's cool. On the Mac, GarageBand is usually free and is incredibly powerful. It's a little bit more involved. I'd recommend starting with a simple touch thing if you're not familiar with music, but if you are, then get into GarageBand. It's really easy to use. I use Ableton Live. Reaper is similar, but is also free. In terms of if you are already in the Mac environment, Spitfire Audio, who are actually some friends of mine, make an incredible free series of instruments, software instruments called Labs. Everything, drums, guitar, dulcimer, djembe, textures from the London Underground, piano. Like, honestly, it's so comprehensive. Again, if you can't find an appropriate sound in there, you must be doing something very niche, because it's all there and it's all free. So recommend that very much. And then lastly, Pure Data, which is for the nerds amongst you, and particularly those of you who work in video and might be familiar with Nuke. It's a kind of visual programming environment where you can set up, you can say, play a musical event at this frequency for this duration, then wait, delay a few seconds, and then do another one. You can do all kinds of logic operations on both sound and sort of data flow, and it's a really interesting, nerdy, but kind of slightly more codey or logic-based system for creating sonic events. And if you have the energy and appetite for it, you can, again, do almost anything you can possibly imagine in there. And that is all we've got time for. But I suppose my final message is just remember that sound is just wiggly air. Music theory and musical instruments are invented by humans to describe frequency relationships, and we all understand language and those kind of intuitive sonic things that we all experience every day. So you are absolutely qualified, if you want to start making some sounds, start testing them on people, and see if it can improve your product and service user journeys. And that's it. My name is Tom Ridley. I made a very quick website where you can see some of the things I've done. There's also a contact form there, or a contact button. And if you've got any questions, seriously, or like, hey, I made this, do you think it's any good? I'd love to hear from you. That would be sweet. And that's it. So I'll be hanging around for some Q&A after this if you have any questions. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks very much, Tom. That was absolutely brilliant. And I really appreciate all the time and effort you must have put into that talk. That was absolutely incredible. Very, very thought-provoking. I've got some questions, if that's all right, from various attendees. First one's from Nick. I think this is in relation to the hair straightener. I never imagined the hair straightener would have that many sounds associated with it. It's amazing. But the question was, did all the kind of sounds have like a visual or like a haptic equivalent as well to kind of convey that message?
Good question. No, that product didn't do any haptics. And most of the sounds occurred when you might not be holding a hair straightener because it took time to heat up, right? Just like any product like that. They were usually alerting, when it's out of your hand and perhaps on the other side of the room that something's happened. There was a visual display. There was an OLED designed by my good friend Leanne, which had visual cues when you were using it, but they did accompany the low battery sounds. There's a little blinking animation, but everything else was sort of for when you're not interacting with it.
Right, brilliant, thank you. A question from Majara. How do you test sounds in terms of how they're perceived by people? Do you play them to people to see whether they respond to them in the way you intended? Like, how does that bit work?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose much the same, excuse me, as like any kind of digital prototype testing. We did tend to do more in person because when I was at Dyson, at least, we were working broadly in the realms of a physical product. So we were conducting interviews in facilities. But yeah, we would provide them with context, and as I said, that turned out to be really important. When we tested sounds in the absence of context, this thing has done this noise. What do you think it means? It obviously wasn't very meaningful. And like I said, the positivity or negativity or urgency maybe would come through, but maybe exactly what was wrong wouldn't work. But with context, for example, they've just turned a hair straightener on. The positive sound would probably mean, okay, it's ready to use. So it would be much the same as providing stimulus to any test participant in digital design.
Right. And it was really interesting. The diagram you showed where you were trying to almost like second guess where sound might be useful. Does it start from, do you decide that first, or do you somehow map what people are doing to kind of understand where they need a bit of a helping hand? Like, which way does that go round?
Definitely the latter.
Right.
I can't think of an example other than perhaps a fancy engine sound, like startup sound in the automotive project, where we said that a sound is going to happen here. It was all about, designing a useful product or journey or service for someone, have them use it and see where there were problems which we maybe couldn't fix with a visual solution or a haptic one if they're not touching it. And therefore sound became the obvious solution.
Brilliant. And it's interesting you were talking about the kind of sort of aspects of internationalization and how sound's perceived in different places. And actually just thinking about Twee's great talk this morning about kind of cultural differences and things. I mean, how do you work around that? Is that just something you have to test, or is there, how's that happen?
Yeah, it's something that we tested, and Asia was one of the lead markets for the hair care projects. I mean, in fact, for all Dyson products, huge market over there. So I spent a bit of time in Shanghai and in Singapore testing with as many diverse user groups as we could, and we did run into some problems where certain reference points that we were relying on didn't translate. So we had to make something a bit more universal. And sometimes you might try and do something that feels subtle or a bit clever, and that doesn't translate so well. You do often have to be a little more simplistic and clear with the communication.
And are there any kind of standards? Another question from Nick, actually. Are there any standards for designing sound cues? Like, what is there anything you can follow or people can follow to understand that, if you're going to design an error sound, for example, here's what you should do, you shouldn't do. Is there anything that people could turn to?
My understanding is that it's industry specific. So certainly in automotive, certain sounds which are considered safety critical. For example, if you're, I'm sure the guys at Tesla designing their autonomous driving stuff will be racked with legislation around when driver takeover noises that will probably have been defined elsewhere, and also have to be a certain loudness and a certain frequency in order to make sure that someone with 5th percentile hearing gets it, or whatever it is. And similarly with that external driving sound that I mentioned, there was some both frequency content requirements. So it had to hit a certain range from bass to treble, if you will, and also have them at a certain number of decibels at 1 meter from the vehicle. And actually, I have been surprised. The Jaguar I-Pace is quite a common-ish example of an electric car that definitely does make a driving sound, because I've heard it, but it's quite quiet. And actually in Bristol, when they drive past me, I always listen, and I can't often hear it. Conversely, the Renault Zoe, which is a funny little electric bubble car, is super loud, and it makes a weird Star Wars noise when it drives past. So look out for one of those on the road, and you'll see what I mean.
Presumably intentional as well. And probably a final question, if we can squeeze one more in, if that's all right.
Yeah.
You were saying about almost inadvertently recreating that synth pop thing, which I think I recognise as well, but I couldn't put a name to it. That was
Yazoo. My dad used to have that in the car as a kid. So yeah, it's like lodged in
your head, isn't it? Yeah, it's going to come out somewhere.
Yeah.
What happens if you kind of inadvertently reinvent someone else's sounds? Like, can you kind of check for some kind of copyright, or how do you dance around that?
Yeah, interesting question. So yes, it falls into copyright law, not patent law. And myself and the legal team at Dyson dug very deeply into it. And my understanding at the time was that you have to, for copyright and for sound specifically, you need to have used it, the sound, and prove that it has become a significant part of your identity for long enough in order to protect it. So I wasn't able to say, I hope none of our competitors, well, they don't work anymore, but I hope none of the competitors are watching. But I wasn't able to go, we are going to release a product with this sound, please protect them. They'll say, release the product, and if people start to understand them, then you can protect them. So I think it took Harley Davidson decades to protect the sound of their motorbike engines. I'm sure that the McDonald's da-da-da-da-da has now probably gone into copyright, but it won't have done when that advert first went out in whatever it was 20 years ago. So that's my understanding of how that works.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Tom. Thanks again for your talk. Are you okay to hang around with any more questions on Slack if any come up?
Yeah, I'll be in Slack for about an hour. Yeah.
Brilliant. All right. Thank you, Tom.